Chapter 14, Food Safety Plan, Implementation and Management for Human Food, presented by David Rosson. The focus of this chapter is on overall management of the food safety plan. Elements to be covered include training, plan reanalysis, and the requirements that apply to the preventive controls qualified individual. By the end of this chapter, participants will be able to describe how the food safety plan implementation relates to the facility's food safety system, recognize the importance of training in supporting the implementation of a food safety plan, explain the regulatory requirements for reanalysis of the food safety plan, explain the regulatory requirements of the preventive controls qualified individual as it applies to maintaining the food safety plan. The definitions for food safety plan and food safety system introduced in Chapter 1. The food safety plan is a regulatory definition and is different from the definition of the food safety system. Both definitions are necessary to understand how the concepts connect for effective implementation practices. Let's take a look at the definitions. Food safety plan, a set of written documents that is based on food safety principles, incorporates a hazard analysis, and, as determined from that analysis, appropriate preventive controls, procedures for monitoring, corrective actions, and verification, and a recall plan. Adapted from 21 CFR 117.126. Food safety system, the outcome of implementing the food safety plan and its supporting elements. FDA Hazard Guide. Outlined on this slide are common industry practices that can help to ensure that the food safety plan is to orient participants on the completion of the food safety plan development process and ensure it is effectively developed. This starts with selecting the process for plan development and the decisions that need to be made, including should a facility have just one plan or many plans? And within the plan, what is the defined start and end of the process flow? Collecting information about the product and process flow will make it easier to extract the information needed for the food safety plan. This needs to extend to any prerequisite programs to ensure that they are in place and effective. There are many tasks that need to be completed as part of building a food safety plan. It may be more effective to work on one plan at a time and take it all the way to completion, and at the same time, make sure that the firm follows any pre-existing programs. There are resources that can be helpful as a guide, but it is important to use the tools properly. They may be helpful, but the facility still needs to make sure that all aspects of the regulation are addressed. Resources include using standardized forms or teaching examples in this course represent one way to manage specific hazards in these food safety plan teaching examples, and as a guide only to see how hazards could be addressed. It is highly unlikely that a company's food safety plan will match the FSPCA teaching examples exactly. The Food Safety Plan Builder may be helpful in documenting the food safety plan. Although the content of the Food Safety Plan Builder is consistent with the FDA's existing guidance and regulations, its use does not mean that their food safety plan, preventive controls, good manufacturing practices, and other food safety procedures are approved by FDA or comply with FDA requirements. It is crucial that any facility using the Food Safety Plan Builder review the outcome to ensure that it accurately reflects the conditions and operations in their plant. For successful implementation, there must be training, oversight, and reanalysis conducted at the appropriate times. When the food safety plan is well organized, the overall management and implementation of the food safety plan are more effective. Several approaches are necessary for effective management of the food safety plan. While the regulation does not specify an approach, the common industry practices related to implementation can be used as a guide. For example, management must demonstrate a commitment to producing safe food and ensure that appropriate resources are made available to enable that to occur. It is best to have well-defined roles and responsibilities for optimal management and implementation of the food safety plan. There must be an overall coordinator, typically the preventive controls qualified individual, and food safety team, which provides input and to which various tasks can be delegated. The trainer ensures that proper instructions are given to the appropriate individuals, and a consultant may be used to assist with management and implementation. The goal should be to ensure consistent oversight, document control, and records management. There must be sufficient resources available for proper training of delegated individuals to conduct their assigned activities. Other common industry practices focus on ensuring that oversight is consistently practiced, establishing document and record controls, and assuring enough time is allotted for required tasks to be fully completed. Developing and implementing a food safety plan can be difficult, especially when integrating it into an existing system of procedures. It is important to maintain consistency in plans especially related to the control of hazards. For example, if a hazard on an incoming ingredient is to be controlled by an internal process, control in one instance, it then cannot be determined that a control is not required for the hazard, or that a hazard does not exist in the ingredient in another plan. Once implemented, a food safety plan will generate a daily stream of paperwork. There will be different forms for different processes, and those forms will need to be reviewed and then filed for easy access. Designing a document control process to ensure the proper forms are being used and that they are being properly reviewed and filed will allow for more efficient handling of documentation and will make inspections easier. Placing titles and control numbers on forms will help staff recognize the appropriate paperwork and version of that paperwork. It is important that staff have sufficient time to conduct the necessary activities, such as performing required calibration, reviewing documentation, and conducting training. It is too easy to miss these activities because production-related needs may pull people away from this work. It is also important to have the proper tools for conducting the required activities. Having accurate and reliable equipment will prevent situations where a measurement is missed because the monitoring equipment failed. In 21 CFR 117.4, the regulation outlines the qualifications required of individuals who manufacture, process, pack, or hold food. It is essential that individuals are qualified to carry out their specific assigned duties. This qualification can be met through education, training, or experience. These individuals must receive training in the principles of food hygiene and food safety, including the importance of employee health and personal hygiene, as appropriate to the food, the facility, and the individual's assigned duties. Requirements extend to supervisory personnel as well. Supervisors must have the education, training, or experience, or a combination thereof, necessary to supervise the production of clean and safe food. Records documenting this required training must be established and maintained by the facility. Let me run that by you. One more time. Qualified individual. A person who has the education, training, or experience, or a combination thereof, necessary to manufacture, process, pack, or hold clean and safe food as appropriate to the individual's assigned duties. A qualified individual may be, but is not required to be, an employee of the establishment. 21 CFR 117.3. Training is important for the success of a food safety program. Those who perform the training of others should be qualified and knowledgeable in the subject matter being taught and be competent in the process of training. This includes understanding the needs of adult learners so that training will be effective. Trainers should be aware of the needs of adult learners and how to best address those needs. Trainers should choose appropriate training methods that align optimally with the training needs. This should include an assessment of online versus face-to-face training methods and consideration of when on-the-job training would be most effective. Training should be directed towards what is most relevant for the operation, the specific employees, and should be specific to the food safety plan. There are many ways to document training activities. Examples can be found in Appendix 3. Training required by the regulation is food safety and hygiene training, including the importance of employee health and personal hygiene, e.g., hand washing. The regulation requires documentation of the food safety and hygiene training as detailed in 21 CFR 117.4b2. Records of training could include attendance lists or training documents maintained in individual personnel files. The approach is flexible. Experience, training, or education related to job duties all qualify as methods of training for a qualified individual. The reality is that a food safety system and food safety plan will continually change over time, and it is important that there is routine oversight to ensure that the system continues to function as designed. Questions to be addressed in the periodic review should answer: is the facility doing the right thing? Is the facility implementing the plan accordingly? In addition to a periodic review, the regulation requires that reanalysis be done. Implementation records are a necessary element of the food safety system. In general, there are two types of required records in the preventive controls for human food regulation. 1. The food safety plan itself, and 2. The implementation records. All food safety plan and implementation records are subject to review and copying by regulatory personnel. Examples of implementation records include, where applicable, records that document the actual monitoring of preventive controls, corrective actions taken, different verification activities performed, validation activities performed, if needed, of all preventive controls, the supply chain program checks, and applicable training records. There must be a review of implementation records, and the review must be documented. The purpose of the review is to ensure the steps in the food safety plan to control hazards have been performed consistently and safely. In other words, implementation records demonstrate the effectiveness of the food safety system and that the facility did what the facility was supposed to do. Records should be organized to enable easy access and review of the entire system. Well-organized records also provide the ability to identify trends and determine where improvements to the system may be needed. Per the regulation, 21 CFR 117.170, in addition to the verification activities for CCPs and other preventive controls, strategies must be developed for scheduled reanalysis of the food safety plan. Reanalysis is required at least every 3 years or whenever there is a significant change in the product or process. If information becomes available about a new hazard associated with the food, e.g. FDA issues an advisory notice, or if there is a failure with the system such as discovering an ineffective preventive control, an outbreak, or similar situation, when an unanticipated problem or deviation occurs, i.e., a specific corrective action procedure has not been established, and if a preventive control is found to be ineffective in that the hazard was not properly controlled. This can be identified through product testing conducted by a customer, consumer complaints, or other means. Significant changes in the product or process, which may require reanalysis and sometimes additional validation, include when an event or situation may alter the original conclusions. Examples include the following: raw material changes, including a new supplier, may require reanalysis to determine if there is a potential for food safety related functional properties to be altered. For example, a new thickening agent may change the viscosity of a product, which could have an impact on heating characteristics for some products. Switching suppliers may also warrant a review of the new supplier's allergen controls to assure that a new hazard is not introduced. The process may also require reanalysis. Product or process changes may warrant reanalysis. For example, reducing the level of salt, which can alter microbial growth patterns, may require evaluation for some products. Intended shelf life, process requirements, and other elements of the system may require reanalysis. If a new allergen is introduced on a production line, reanalysis of the procedures used to clean the system may be warranted to validate that surfaces can be adequately cleaned to remove allergens. Increasing production volumes that lead to longer run times may provide more time for microbial growth during some processes. The adequacy of sanitation to maintain sanitary conditions during the longer run time may be assessed as part of the reanalysis. Implementation issues identified during record reviews or observation of recurring deviations may suggest that the original validation is no longer adequate. This may trigger reanalysis of the full system, including validation of the elements of a process that are not performing in a reliable manner. Emerging scientific information on hazards or control measures may also trigger reanalysis activities. For example, when E. coli O 157:H7 first emerged as a foodborne pathogen, it was observed that it tolerates higher levels of acid than many other foodborne pathogens. A reanalysis of process lethality was needed. New distribution or identification of unanticipated consumer handling practices may also trigger reanalysis. For example, if an RTE product distributed to the general public, though retail sales is subsequently marketed for infants, revalidation of controls to protect this more vulnerable population may be warranted. When the FDA judges that a new hazard or new scientific developments warrant a response from regulated firms. Significant changes may also include construction events, new equipment installation, etc. Reanalysis should occur at a frequency that ensures the food safety plan is being followed continuously. This frequency depends on several conditions, such as the variability of the process and product. In most cases, when reanalysis is conducted, it must take place before any changes are made to the food safety plan. In specific circumstances, it may be necessary to demonstrate control measures can be implemented as designed. In these cases, validation activities that provide support to the reanalysis may take place in the first 90 days of production, or within a reasonable time frame, as justified by the preventive controls qualified individual. If reanalysis indicates an increased food safety risk, the food safety plan must be revised. If it's determined that no revisions are necessary, the basis for that decision must also be documented. The preventive controls qualified individual is responsible for ensuring that reanalysis is performed. The preventive controls qualified individual can do it themselves or oversee the reanalysis process. For example, the facility may contract with an independent consultant to help conduct system-wide verification activities. Verifying that the food safety plan is still applicable and relevant is the focus of reanalysis. This includes reanalysis of the hazard analysis. Reanalysis is required even if the hazard analysis did not identify any hazards requiring a preventive control, in order to ensure that this is still a valid conclusion. Reanalysis activities also include on-site observations and record reviews performed by the food safety team or other unbiased individuals not responsible for performing the monitoring activities. This is to verify that the food safety plan is being followed, and it may identify trends that need to be addressed. Reanalysis must also include an assessment of the food safety system, including the prerequisite programs. Results of the reanalysis must be documented, even if no revisions have been made. If that is the case, the rationale for the decision that no revisions were required needs to be documented in the reanalysis record. A reanalysis checklist may be helpful to ensure that the reanalysis process is implemented effectively and that the results are documented completely. This checklist should include the date reanalysis activities were performed, the outcome of the reanalysis, and who was responsible for the decision. A reanalysis checklist form is found in Appendix 2. It is a regulatory requirement that the food safety plan must be signed and dated by the owner, operator, or agent in charge of the facility. The signing must take place when the food safety plan is initially completed and at any time there is a modification to the food safety plan occurs. The signature ensures management is informed of changes and indicates support for implementation. A food safety plan cover sheet that is signed and dated by the responsible individual is sufficient. A preventive controls qualified individual is required to, among other things, develop or oversee preparation of the food safety plan, validation of the preventive controls, and review of the records and reanalysis of the food safety plan. Required tasks do not have to be performed by a single preventive controls qualified individual. The tasks can be shared among multiple preventive controls qualified individuals. Additional tasks that must be performed or overseen by a preventive controls qualified individual involve written justification in situations where expected timeframes for certain activities are not met. These include justification for completing validation activities after 90 days of first production or determining that validation is not required, justification for review of monitoring and corrective action records exceeding 7 working days, and determining that it is appropriate to perform reanalysis and validation of additional preventive controls in a period longer than the first 90 days of production. There are 2 ways to become a preventive controls qualified individual. The first way is to successfully complete training in the development and application of risk-based preventive controls, at least equivalent to that received under a standardized curriculum recognized as adequate by the FDA, such as attending this FSPCAPCHF training class and successfully completing the exercises. Training must be documented in records, including the date, type of training, person trained, etc. The second way is for an individual to be qualified through job experience to develop and implement a food safety plan. The preventive controls qualified individual can be an external consultant. This chapter has covered what's needed to manage the overall food safety plan. This includes proper oversight and management and training of employees. Since a food safety plan will change over time, long-term verification and overall review of the food safety plan, called reanalysis, must be done as part of the responsibilities of the preventive controls qualified individual at least every 3 years, or when there are significant changes to the product or process and when new information about hazards becomes available. You have completed the lecture for Chapter 14. Be sure to complete the knowledge check as well as the Chapter 14 exercise. See you in Chapter 15.